Hey, friends. So, we're going to look at another shadow work piece today, again, fitting into this overall theme that I've been talking about of the sort of universal shadow. And what we're going to talk about today in our spread is defensiveness. There are times in our lives where we're going to get a piece of important feedback, what we tend now to call calling someone out, but we're going to get called out. We're going to get feedback from someone telling us that something we've done or said, or something we like, something that we have affection for, is problematic. And the first thing that happens for a lot of us, for most of us, many, is that we immediately get defensive. And when I talk about the spread, I'm going to talk more specifically about what that means and the symptoms of defensiveness. But let's talk about why it's an important topic for the kind of shadow work that this series is about, which is this kind of communal, universal shadow. When we get defensive, or when we shut down a conversation about something that is problematic or that someone has told us is problematic, we lose out on the opportunity to grow and to see things from a point of view beyond ours. We lose the opportunity to witness and internalize someone else's experience. And again, I think I talked about this in my first video on this. As a community of tarot readers, of people with new age or spiritual points of view, other people's experiences are really important to us when we're doing healing work, when we're doing readings, when we're counseling, whatever it is we do. But that experience can sometimes become second priority when someone says, hey, there's a problem with this thing that you said did. There's a problem with this thing that you're okay with, but that is really not okay with me. And rather than listening, we get defensive. And when we get defensive, again, we lose out on an opportunity to engage. We're all going to have those moments. Um, an example is an easy example for me as a white man is when someone tells me something I've done or said is potentially racist. When something I've done or enjoyed in the past is problematic. Consider, here's an example from my own experience, right? The movie American Beauty, which I loved when it came out. I don't know, I was in my late teens, early 20s, and I had such a mind-blowing experience with that film. And then forgot about it, as you do. I was obsessed with it for a while, and you get older. And over time, I started reading articles as anniversaries of that film would come up. And people would write about how problematic it is. And I would get really defensive about that because it's a movie that I loved and that meant a lot to me when I was younger. And the implication of the problem, of calling it problematic, was that somehow I was problematic for liking it. And so I go on the defense and I start to protect myself and the film, and I dismiss anyone's concerns with the problems of it. Then, in a conversation with someone, they explain to me, well, it's a movie about a middle-aged straight man um, who is making a 16-year-old girl both the object of his desires and the sort of goddess of his fantasies and his salvation. And I'm like, I didn't anticipate using this example, so I don't quite remember the film. But anyway, it sexualizes young women in a problematic way. And then I go back and I look at the film and I say, you know what, yeah, that falls into a category of problems that we have to talk about. Does that mean I'm problematic? Not necessarily, but it does mean that I need to look at this thing that I loved from a different way, and learn about it, and begin to understand how the sexualization of young women in particular contributes to a whole lot of ills, a whole lot of shadow in our culture and in our society. But I don't get the opportunity to consider that when I'm defensive and saying, no, 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 it's a movie, you don't understand, you don't get what it's trying to say, it was written by a gay man. That's not the point. The point is that there are generations of women who face the consequences of the over-sexualized uh, um, perceptions that we have of them in film, in TV, in songs, from Lolita to Don't Stand So Close to Me, the Sting song. All of those things have contributed to a narrative in our culture that makes it difficult for young women who are that age to navigate the world, to understand what the expectations of them truly should be. Because on the other side of the coin, while we're sexualizing them, we're also slut-shaming them. Now, this isn't a video about that movie. It's not a video about sexualization of teens or about slut-shaming. But it's an example of how defensiveness stops us from learning about the experience of others. And in so doing, we contribute to the shadow, the universal shadow. Um, then if we allow ourselves to let go of the defensiveness and explore our own shadow, maybe we can open up, hear the conversation, listen and engage to someone else's experience, and become a voice that's really an ally. It's truly an ally rather than someone who's concerned with protecting themselves. We who are in majority groups or in powerful power holding groups have an opportunity to amplify the voices of folks who are sharing their experiences through and in despite of marginalization they've experienced at our hands, at our ancestors' hands, whatever the case may be. All right. So what we're talking about when we're talking about defensiveness today in this shadow work is allowing ourselves to resist the temptation to protect ourselves from certain conversations, from certain points of view, open ourselves up to them, and hopefully reduce the universal shadow to some degree by empathizing, taking on another person's experience and letting that expand us and teach us, and then maybe even becoming a voice of a real ally, and helping to amplify the voices, which is even better. It's like better, especially if we're like in a power group, that rather than even delivering the message, that we help amplify the messages of others, right? Rather than taking credit. So again, I'm going to recommend that you try this out, like the one that we did previously. I don't think this is a one-time deal. I really would love to hear your thoughts and how these are working for you. I think sharing your experience is a good thing. But again, I want to caution us all against celebrating our own wokeness in doing this. That's not what this is about. This is about dealing with our own shadow and how we contribute to the universal shadow, not about celebrating our own willingness to do that. So I encourage dialogue about this. Like, I'd really love to hear people share these spreads, talk about their experience with them, but do so in a way that opens the door rather than celebrates ourselves. Okay. So once again, I'm going to go through the spread in a minute and go through an example. Because I don't want this to become about me, I am not. In the first one I did, I obviously used myself as an example. I did a real reading. In this case, I'm going to be more general. I'm going to just do an example. It's not really about me. So I just want to throw that out there. So anything I do or say in the reading that you're about to see is not, it's not related to my own thing. I don't want to sort of again, make this you witnessing my own therapy as I deal with these things. I want to open the door for you to collaborate with yourself and the universe on reducing that universal shadow. Okay, so this is just an example. It's not really me. So let me go ahead and flip over to the PowerPoint, and we'll take a look at the example. All right, here we go. So defensiveness. Here's our spread. All right, so again, I use 3 cards for each position. That's just a personal preference. With something like this, I think the more context you have, the better. I really would recommend using 3 cards, but if 1 card gives you everything you need, then then that's perfect. So the first position in the spread is one way I can tell I'm getting defensive. And I'm going to talk about some symptoms of defensiveness in a minute. But we're all individuals, and so we want to look at one alarm bell we should recognize. The second one we're going to look at is the roots of that defensiveness. And this in the bias spread I did, the unconscious bias spread I did the other day, the first position was the hardest because we were looking at unconscious bias. So it's hard to identify those things. In this spread, I think this position, number 2, is the most difficult. And it's the one that, even in a sample, I really had to sit with for a long time. And it's going to be a difficult one to wrestle with. 3 is the consequences of defensiveness, the consequences of my defensiveness in particular. And then 4, one thing I can do to turn defensiveness into openness, which is really the key of this whole thing. And then, as you know, I like to do the checking my own progress. So that's position number 5. Now, how do we know we're getting defensive, right? There's a lot of things we start to do or say that can really alert us. And we do have a position in the spread that's going to help us discover that. But these are some of the things you're going to start to notice or see when we are having ourselves challenged in a way that maybe we need to engage with. So the first thing that might happen is there's a tendency to feel hurt or anger when you're questioned. So in my American Beauty example, someone says, well, that movie you love is really problematic. And I get uptight and really upset, or I get hurt that they're trying to tell me that I'm a problem. The need to explain what you really meant or what you really mean. The American Beauty example doesn't really have that because I didn't say anything about it. But let's say I had said, American Beauty really reflects how male-female relationships are. And someone said, boy, Ben, that's really problematic. And I say, well, you don't understand what I really mean. Let me, that's another thing that might happen. Or if, let's say that this is a conversation I'm having with a female identifying person. And she says to me, that's kind of sexist. And I say, well, my friend Beth disagrees. So that's another way to sort of defend myself by saying, well, this other person who is, quote, in your category doesn't agree with you. So I guess I'm right. We can explain away someone else's feelings with nostalgia. So, that movie came about at a really pivotal time in my teens, and I know that it's an issue, but you got to look at it from my point of view and what an influence that had on me, and it really makes me feel all these great things from my youth. And again, when I'm doing that, I'm not listening. Maybe all of those things are true, but that's not the conversation we're having right now. I can also explain it away by saying, well, you're just being oversensitive. Everything's a problem. All movies are problems. If American Beauty is problematic, then so is Sabrina, and so is How to Marry a Millionaire, and, all of the classics, and Lolita and whatever. You're just being oversensitive. That's another way to exhibit defensiveness, or another sign that you are. Throwing up your hands and saying, well, I can't say anything anymore. I can't even talk about a movie that moved me when I was a teenager. What the fuck? You know what I mean? It's just everything's a problem. Everything's a problem these days. I can't say anything without being attacked. It's defensiveness. Just that initial feeling of embarrassment that someone would think you're terrible. Because, of course, the implication of being told that something we do, say, think, feel, whatever, is problematic is that the implication is that we're bad. And that's a misreading of the conversation. In fact, if someone thought you were bad, they probably wouldn't say anything because they don't think you can change. If someone's giving us this opportunity, that's a pretty good sign that they think we have some interest in growing. The resentment of political correctness has a lot to do with feeling like you can't say anything anymore. It's kind of the same thing. Disengaging from the conversation, I'm done, I'm not talking about this, I don't want to hear it. That's obviously defensiveness. And then seeking validation. So this is similar to the one where I say, explain that someone else doesn't feel like this the same way. So in this case, I could say, well, my friend doesn't agree with you, and she's a woman too. but the other side of that thing is like, then I get this feedback from you, and then I go and ask my friend Beth, and I say, hey Beth, isn't this ridiculous? Like, you agree with me, right? And then now I'm putting someone else in the position to have to defend me. So in that case, I'm kind of building an army. All of these and more are signs of defensiveness, but it's good to think about these things if we're going to face ourselves, which is a lot of what this shadow work is all about, is about facing our darker side, facing our shadows. So again, this spread is meant to help us explore the roots of that and hopefully shine light on those shadows. So let's look at the first position, all right? So I have, again, this is not a real example, but I have made some notes. This is not easy. None of this is. And so I think it's really misleading in a way when I make these videos, because I'm going to go through them relatively quickly. And so it suggests that this is a fast process, but it's not. It probably took me close to an hour of sitting with these three, with each set of three, to come up with even just these samples. So this is work, and it should be work if we really want to get a lot out of it, especially with the early ones. The things that ask us to look at ourselves. Those are hard. So this is the Japaridza deck by Nino Japaridza. This is out of print, although I just heard there's a rumor that US Games has gotten so many requests that they're bringing it back. I don't know if that's true yet, but hopefully. Anyway, so the first position in the spread is one way I can tell I'm getting defensive. So if this were a real reading, I would pull these cards and I would sit with them and I would say, well, what's a sign that I'm getting? What's one alert bell within me that makes me feel like I'm getting defensive, that I need to sort of be aware of so that I can combat it in the future? And so sitting with this, I get the Eight of Wands, which would be swords, the World, and the Jester of Gardens, which would be the Page of Pentacles or coins. And so just to sort of summarize very, very easily, it's easy to summarize. You sit with this and right out of the gate, that Eight of Wands really impacts my field of vision, right? Like that Eight of Swords energy. I feel like I'm trapped in an argument. Swords being that argument, the words, the communication. I feel like I'm trapped in that. And like the whole world is against me. If we look at the way the character in the Eight of Wands has its back to the world, I feel like the whole world is against me. And that they view me as some kind of clown who doesn't understand anything about the world. And that really I just get from the Jester of Gardens as the clown, literally as the jester, but then the Page as someone immature. And Pentacles being the world or life. So I feel like I'm trapped in these arguments, the whole world is against me, and everyone feels like I'm an immature clown who doesn't understand the world, who doesn't understand life. And that would be, if this were a real reading, that would be my warning sign that my defenses are starting to come up, is that I start to go down this sort of victimhood path in this particular set. Right? So the next set is the roots of my defensiveness. And as I said, this is the hardest one. I really, again, even in this fictional example, had to sweat this one out. And it was not easy, particularly with this set of cards. Now, you'll notice that the world shows up here, and it was in the previous one too. So just if you watched the unconscious bias video, I do shuffle and draw after each set of three. So I laid this out, then shuffled again and drew these three, and did that for all the positions. I like when cards show up more than once, because I start to notice themes, and that's just a thing. You don't have to do that, or you could do multiple decks or whatnot, but I just like that. So the roots of our defensiveness are deep, and so like the unconscious bias, this is not easy. And this, even in an example, was not easy to sit with and struggle with. The devil in the center really makes me think of like a machine, and an addictive machine, a cycle that I can't get out of. And so in my notes, I wrote this thing of like the addiction of working this way. We're used to working in this machine. It's how the world works. I didn't make it that way. This is just how the world works. That's how things go. The world is angry. There's a lot of fire in it. It's always on the edge of erupting. And all of my energy is in order to survive, I just have to deal with that. I have to exist in the world. And so the roots then of my defensiveness come out of the fact that I'm just a pawn like everyone else in this machine. Like, the world is the problem, and everything's always exploding. So again, it's a divorce from my own responsibility. The devil made me do it. The devil makes me do it. So there's like an abdication of responsibility. So the roots of the defensiveness in this case, if this were really a real reading, would be about the fact that I've adopted a worldview where I'm powerless to engage. Because the machinery is always cranking out, this is just the way the world is, and I'm just a pawn in it, and everything's going to explode anyway. So there's a total passivity. So the roots then of the defensiveness comes from just a passivity, a feeling of like, I don't really have to engage with this because it's not my problem. Let me go back. The third spot is the consequences of defensiveness. All right. So this was a really interesting one too. Now, if you're reading about a real situation, this you'll find will probably get more specific because you're probably thinking about a specific time or a specific person. But if you're doing this just as a general journaling or exploration activity, this may be a little vague because you're thinking in terms of the broader consequences of your actions within what I keep calling the universal shadow. But I think they can be equally impactful. And again, this array of cards was really striking to me, and immediately I thought, well, what are the consequences? I fiddle while Rome burns. I feel good. The Six of Fires, like, I feel good about the way things are, while people who are struggling to fight are in free fall, and they're struggling to defend themselves against, a herd of bulls racing toward them. I saw the King of Fire, and I thought of a Toreador. And you see strength here. This character seems to be in total free fall. So these strong people are in free fall. They're trying to defend themselves. And I'm just playing away, feeling good about myself. And so while I feel good, Rome is burning. And other people are trying to survive and defend themselves. And I'm the only one who's enjoying myself. And that's the consequence. So what a way to contribute to the, universal shadow, right? So that's position 3. Position 4 is one thing there's a typo there. One thing I can do to turn my defensiveness into openness. And here we get the Ace of Wands, the Tower, and the Ten of Tides. And again, a brilliant, really fascinating combo here. So with the Ace of Wands, which would be swords, and the Ten of Tides, which would be cups. And the Tower is a really interesting combination. So how do I start to turn my defensiveness into openness so that I can receive this conversation, so that I can engage in the contribution to the lightening of the universal shadow? I have to reset my mind. I have to really stop the argument, stop the tendency to fight, right? Swords are weapons. The mind is also a weapon. So I stop and I reset and I experience the crumbling feeling. Because what happens when I'm resetting my defensiveness, when I'm avoiding fighting, is that I'm submitting myself to having my view changed. I'm allowing myself to endure a transformation that probably isn't fun. Because it's not fun to realize that things we've loved and cared for or said and done innocently hurt people. So I have to endure that. And I have to feel the full experience of it. With the Ten of Cups, we have to go through the whole feeling of it. So I reset, I stop, I don't fight, I endure the feelings, I remain open to the feelings, and I experience the full measure of them. And again, this is just an example, but that's actually pretty good advice in general. All right, and so the 5th position then is, how do I check my progress? Because, we may have a situation where someone gives us feedback like that, and we're like, you know what, you're right, that's a great point. And then another day comes, and we're like, fuck you. And we're going to have moments where we backslide. We all do it. So how am I checking my progress? The 10 of Tides shows up again. And here we look at, are we allowing ourselves to experience the full measure of everything that happens when we do this, when we experience this? Are we allowing ourselves to feel all the feelings rather than getting defensive? And then the Two of Wands comes along. We had the Ace of Wands in the previous one. Is our mind expanding? Are we now able to see another side of something, to hear another side of something? And then with the Star, for me, is always direction. Do I have a path forward? Am I looking toward the future? Do I have hope that I'm getting better? Do I have a sense of direction that I'm getting better, that I'm opening up? So that's how I check my progress, is I check in with myself. When this happens, am I feeling the full measure of things? Am I able to see new sides of situations? Am I looking in the right direction? Am I moving toward the future? I talked about in my intro, I said amplifying the messages of others. Within the Star, I think you can absolutely see that as something. Is my direction making the way easier for others? Am I serving as a beacon for others, as a light, as a guide for others? That's a really good way to do that too. So again, general reading, but just for example, there's lots of stuff here I think that is very universal. All right. So that's this whole spread. Again, I think it's important to consider our shadow work not only from our own individual healing, but from the universal healing. And so again, this series is meant to kind of open up our thinking towards how we can use shadow work to explore how we fit in to the overall light and shadow of our community and of our world and of our families and cities and towns and all of that, and in doing so, I think it opens us up and it makes us less defensive, makes us aware of our unconscious biases, etc. So that's the next one in the series. I don't know how many there are going to be. I have a couple other ideas. I'm about to go out of town for work for a few days, so it'll probably be a little while before I post again, but always interested in your thoughts. Thanks so much to everyone who commented with really positive responses to the unconscious bias. I hope this one is equally as interesting, and we'll talk soon.